I'm Chrissy and I'm part of the Blitsy creative team. I'm also Spectrum Noir accredited, which is why I'm here today to show you how to create a card using Spectrum Aqua Markers. They're like watercolors. If you don't know what watercolors are, they're paints that react with water in all different ways. You can add water, you can take water away to make things darker or lighter. But with these markers, you have a little bit more control than normal watercolors, so they're really exciting to use. So let's get started. First, we're gonna take a sheet of watercolor paper and we're gonna cut it down to 3 3/4 by 5 inches. This is gonna be the front panel of your card. Grab your paper trimmer, slide the paper underneath, and cut it to 3 3/4 by 5 inches. So you might notice sometimes, if you're using a pack of paper like me, you get a little bit of glue residue on the top of your paper. I always try to cut from the end that doesn't have the residue so it doesn't show up on my card. Now we're gonna cut the card base. I'm using black cardstock. I'm gonna cut it to 4 1/4 by 11. Grab your trimmer again and let's cut 4 1/4. And since I'm using a 12 by 12 sheet of paper, I have to trim this side a little bit as well, just to 11. And while we're at it, we're gonna score the panel with the scoreboard. Just go ahead and line it up in the corner. We're gonna score it right at the 5 1/2. I usually score it just a few times to make sure everything's okay. Then I fold it. The last step I do for this is I run the bone folder across, just to make sure my card is gonna be nice and flat when it's all done. And lastly, we're gonna find some patterned paper to put as our frame for our front panel. So I'm gonna look for the paper that I like the best for this particular card. And I think this one's gonna work for me. Grab your trimmer for one last time. And we're gonna cut this to 4 by 5 1/4. And now we are all set to get our card started. We've cut our base, our frame, and our front panel. Now it's time to stamp. I'm gonna grab this set from Avery Elle, and I'm also going to use 2 different distressings, pumice stone and broken china. Let's open up our stamps. And first I'm gonna use the cute little elephant. I'm gonna peel him off the backing, and we're just gonna push him on this acrylic block. Now I'm gonna grab my pumice stone, and I'm gonna ink it up. Make sure you've got it all covered. Then I'm gonna stamp it on a scratched piece of paper. Then onto our card panel we just cut. We only want a light image. We don't want a really dark image to take away from the watercolors that we're gonna be applying. Now we're gonna do the same thing again, but we're gonna use the bubbles. So peel it off, place it on a block, and then I'm grabbing the broken china distress ink. Ink it up again. Stamp on that scratched piece of paper first. And now, since we have a lightened image, let's stamp it on that card panel. It looks like the elephant is blowing bubbles. To color in our card, we're gonna use Spectrum Aqua Markers. These aren't regular markers. They're actually more like watercolors. Once you add water to them, they react like normal watercolors would, except these are a little bit easier to control because we have 2 tips of markers that we can work with. So to start, What I normally do is I take an acrylic block like I would for stamping, and I actually take the marker and I color onto the block. You can color directly onto the image, but that's gonna be a bit more vibrant. I really want that soft watercolor look. So I'm gonna take this, put it on the block, and then dilute it with water. So now that I have my color, this basically becomes my palette. And I'm gonna take a water brush, or you can use a paintbrush with some water, and I'm just gonna go ahead and start adding a real little bit of water. So once my brush is loaded up with the color and the water, I'm gonna start coloring in some of the darker parts of the elephant, just where I want my shading to be. Now you can start with a light color first if you prefer. I just usually start with the darks so I can find my shadows easier. That's just kind of the way that I roll. If you feel like some of this is too dark, you can always add a little bit more water to dilute the color. And then to dry everything and make it go faster, I'm gonna use my heat gun. You don't have to do this, but I like to do it because it speeds up the process. Now I'm gonna add my lights. So I'm gonna do the same as I did before. I'm just gonna scribble on here. Add a little bit of water. And this time, I'm gonna cover pretty much all of the elephant. It may look kind of messy now, but let those watercolors do their work. You can always add a little bit more water in to help it blend. You can see there that it's starting to blend a little bit better. Just keep going back and forth, so you get the look that you want. Now I mentioned that these markers have two different nibs. We saw the brush nib already. There's the small nib, and that's what I was talking about where you have more control. So, some of these areas are bleeding a little bit. I'm gonna take the nib and just kind of fix that. So nobody ever needs to know that some of this bled onto the paper a little bit. Okay, and then just keep coloring. The process takes a little bit, does take a little bit of practice too, but feel free to be messy. Watercolors are meant to be. They don't have to be perfect. So when you feel like you need to add maybe some medium tones, you can grab another color and do that. So here you can see all the different layers. I'm only using 2 colors, but you can see the difference between the light, medium, and dark, just about how many times you're gonna go over it. So I'm just gonna kind of keep adding more water. And if you feel like you need more ink, make it darker, go ahead. Now you can tell where I first added those dark colors, see how they're blending. I really recommend, you don't have to use watercolor paper, but if you really want that true watercolor effect, I would definitely suggest it. These don't blend as well on normal cardstock. The nice thing about these too is if it starts drying, just add more water and then you're right back in it. You can even let it dry a day and come back with water and still like you've never even left. Now I've noticed that some of the lines on my card have blurred a little bit, so I'm gonna grab my marker again with that small little tip and just kind of clean it up a little bit. Just going in with the shadows. This is absolutely not necessary, it just kind of depends upon your style. Now the more water you add, the more it's gonna bleed, and the less you add, the less it's gonna bleed. I added quite a bit of water, which is why my lines are kind of all over the place, but I like that look. So because we lost a lot of the lines, which was what we were going for, I'm gonna go ahead and add his eye back in, just using a black marker. I'm using a Spectrum Aqua, but you could use any type of black marker. I'm not gonna add any more water to this anymore in this area. So I'm just gonna draw a little eye on there about where I think it was. The elephant is all done. Now it's time to color in the bubbles. We're just gonna use 1 color this time instead of 2 or 3. Same as before, gonna take it and just put it on a clear block. Then grab your water brush again. Make sure it's clean. If you need to put it on a paper towel to make sure you don't have any of that gray left, go ahead. And then just like before, add a little bit of water and start coloring. So I'm gonna do all of these, and then I'm gonna hit it with my heat gun so I can get that different layer look again. Okay, now let's add another layer of color. Make it just so some of those shadows show up again, just to the bottom of the bubbles. So you can see I have basically my light source coming from here because I have most of my dark spots over here. So I want to continue that with the bubbles as well. And now our bubbles are complete. It's time to add some grass. Now we're going to do this a little bit freehand. There's no stamp that we're following, but it's actually really, really easy. We're going to scribble on the block just like we've done before. And just like we've done before, we're gonna add a little bit of water. So now just kind of draw blades of grass. It doesn't have to be perfect, grass never is. And all you're doing is taking the marker and basically you're scribbling with watercolor here. So now once this is dry, or you can hit it with the heat gun again, we're gonna go in with more green and add a new layer to make it look like real grass. This way we just have a couple different colors like real grass. Some in the front and some in the back. Now we're gonna create the sky. It's gonna be freehand again, but this time we're gonna use a paintbrush and some water instead of a water brush. Dip the brush in some water, and we're just gonna add some water across the back before we add the color. This is gonna dilute the color, and it's gonna make the color spread pretty much on its own. You have to work kind of fast, because if the water dries, it's not gonna work. Now we're gonna color on here again. We just need a little bit. Dip the brush in water, and see how the color just spreads? This is even easier than the grass. The more water you add, the lighter it gets. If you feel like you need to add more color up at the top, you can go ahead and add a little bit more. You can see my paper's curling a little bit. That's just what happens when the water gets a hold of the watercolor. So you can let it sit underneath something, or you can hit it with the heat gun, and then it should be a-okay. Pull it down a little bit, and there we go. Your sky is created. Now we're gonna add a sentiment to finish off our card. I'm using that same stamp set that we used earlier for the elephant and the bubbles. So just peel off your stamp, just like we did earlier. I'm going to pick the Celebrate sentiment. That's kind of generic. I like to make a lot of my cards generic, so that way if I need them for birthday, congratulations, graduation, whatever it is, I have a nice amount of cards in my stash. Now before we stamp it on here, make sure that this panel is 100% dry. If it's wet at all, the ink, once you stamp it, is gonna just bleed out, and it's gonna ruin this card that we spent so much time on. So you can let it sit for a few hours, you can use a heat gun to dry it, just make sure that it's perfectly dry before you stamp. So I'm using some Memento Tuxedo Black ink. I'm gonna go ahead and ink up my stamp, just like we did before. And I'm just gonna go stamp it here right next to the elephant. And there we go. Our sentiment is set and our card is almost done. For our final step, we're gonna put everything together. Remember those panels we cut earlier? Now it's gonna pull together and make a final card. Now grab some type of adhesive. I use an extra strong tape runner. When you're using watercolor paper, you wanna make sure you have a really strong adhesive. The paper buckled a little bit while we were coloring, and that's normal because we added the water, but you wanna make sure that your tape runner is strong enough to hold that on the actual card so your edges don't pop up. So take the pattern paper we cut, go ahead and start adding some adhesive. I usually run them along the sides and one along the middle. You can see this is pretty strong, it's sticking to my fingers, so I know I'm pretty good. And then just line it up onto your card base. There we go. I push it down just to make sure it's nice and flat. And now we're gonna add the watercolor paper. So this I add a little bit more, kind of hit the corners a little bit, just because like I said earlier, we don't want it to peel up. I probably add a little more than actually is necessary, but I don't want that to come off, especially if I'm sending this card in the mail. I don't want the recipient to get a card that's already falling apart before they open the envelope. So just press this down. Lots of times I press it from the back too. And there we go. Now we have our finished watercolor card using Spectrum Aquas. I really love using my Spectrum Aqua Markers as watercolors. There's so many different options to create different looks. You can add more water or less water to make them more or less vibrant. You can even color directly on or create a palette, kind of like we did. I really hope that you'll give this technique a try.